Thank you for the introduction, Patrick. My name is Jake Forbes, as you said. So I work at Star Stable, and I'm the creative director. I started out as a narrative director, writing all of the quests and dialogue for the game for the last 4 years. But as our company's grown, the creative director now covers the game, but also novels and graphic novels. We have an animated series debuting next month on YouTube. And so we are very much becoming a transmedia, multi-product storytelling platform. And so for this topic, for today's lecture, I wanted to talk about fan fiction, which is something that's deeply personal to me, but both in regards to Star Stable and the unique audience that we have, but also how we can look at kind of underserved audiences and ways of telling stories that might have traditionally been ignored by the gaming industry. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. All right, so as our author of our own, what persistent games can learn from fan fiction. All right, so I joined Star Stable in 2017 when my family relocated to Stockholm from the US. And like most American game devs, I'd never heard of Star Stable, but it didn't take much to convince me that this is where I wanted to be. Star Stable is one of the biggest games that no one talks about. Aside from being a virtual world for horse girls of all ages and backgrounds, it's also a substantial work of fiction with hundreds of characters, thousands of quests, and it's growing every year. We're going into our 10th year of live operations. And since I've joined the company, we've expanded to novels, animation, and graphic novel on the way. Star Stable is epic, but in the games industry, that alone is not unique. But what makes Star Stable special is that it's speaking to an audience who's been traditionally left on the margins. It gives this audience a voice and a place to call their own. So what first drew me to games was a passion for storytelling. I started in film school. I worked in publishing. I always was passionate about stories, and for me, games was the final frontier of storytelling. It's a place where being a part of, you could be the protagonist of your own story. Instead of passively consuming them, you could make the story your own. And I was fully subscribed to the cult of choices and consequences. And isn't that the ultimate fantasy? Being in control of your destiny and watching the story bend to your whims and your ambitions. So when you look at a beloved story world, an IP like Harry Potter, and you kind of extrapolate what would be the ultimate fan experience if you really wanted to realize those dreams, like you might imagine something like this, focusing on immersion, fidelity, consequence, the limitless possibilities, the ultimate Hogwarts adventure all your own, with you as the star. But the reality is that a lack of a proper Hogwarts sandbox game hasn't kept that particular fandom from making their own stories. The fans have been busy. It's just that the stories that they consume and create in droves look more like this. So what is fan fiction? It's a form of fan labor. It's stories written by fans of an existing work, such as a TV show, novel, or game. The concept of fan fiction isn't new. People have been picking up pens to continue their favorite stories after the author stopped for well over 100 years. Like even Shakespeare, his works were kind of riffing off of established ideas. But the modern understanding kind of dates back to the Star Trek fandom and the Spockanalia fanzine, because that's when we really started to see fandom start to create a culture around pop culture brands, where fans were kind of gathering together and finding a way to trade their works. Because I think in order for fan fiction to really enter the modern era, you need to be able to both create and share with like-minded fans. So the internet really allowed this to explode. Archive of Our Own is the biggest kind of repository of fan fiction. And finally, there's a place to post any ideas that you have about a world, to find things, find from like-minded creators. And it's an easy way to sort. And also with fan fiction, a lot of it can be pretty risque. So it's also a way to provide safety to explore ideas that might be taboo, but also to kind of shield yourself from things that you don't want to see. So fan fiction, it's not for everybody, or not every story is for everybody, but the spirit of fan fiction is one of safety and security. So fan fiction is also, it's intensely personal for me because prior to games, I had the great honor of working on a sequel to Jim Henson's Labyrinth, the movie from the 80s with David Bowie that was a huge fan of that as a child. I watched the VHS until it wore out. And after I worked in comics for a while, I wanted to to kind of get out of working on localization of works from Japan, where it's mostly just editing in an invisible process, and try to tell my own stories. But the first step that I take was one that many fan fiction writers take, which is to start with an established brand. Even though the Return to Labyrinth books are authorized, it was done with the consent and approvals of the Jim Henson Company. At the time, there was so little oversight that I was effectively was making fan fiction. So a lot of my critics and fans said as much. I had a lot of comparisons to fan fiction, but I think that's okay with me. I really love being a part of that, and it's something that it's kind of inspired my work since then. So why is it worth looking at fan fiction as a game creator? Well, you could say that fan fiction is it's fandom's id, but it's you see the impulses and the desires and the dreams of the audience. That what are they? Where are they taking a brand when they can embrace it on their own terms? But it's also, I think, a glimpse into the future of games. I think the stories that are being told in fan fiction tend to migrate out into the mainstream. It starts a little bit more niche, but those ideas become more and more accepted. In fan fiction, there have been a number of artists or writers who have kind of gone from the fan fiction community to getting publishing deals. That's not the reason to participate in fan fiction, but fan fiction has been covered quite heavily in recent years in all the major kind of newspapers, and understanding that it is a legitimate form of creation. It's getting some respectability, but the respectability I don't think is nearly as important as the fact that fan fiction has been a safe place for those who haven't been able to engage with fandom in the past. So especially women and people who aren't cis hetero males, it allows them to engage with fandom on their own terms. And there's been a lot of hate and misogyny lobbed at fan fiction over the years, such as the demonization of the Mary Sue trope. But existing as it does beyond the purview of gatekeepers, fan fiction has endured and thrived while the rest of fandom has been struggling to catch up. Fan fiction, it empowers the community. Whether you're a prolific writer or a voracious reader, or just a fan in the periphery looking in, it's a very empowering experience. As it exists outside the commercial marketplace, and since it almost always has a layer of anonymity, fan fiction can offer a peek into the mind of those enthusiastic fans, and we can see how it allows the reader and writer to play with taboos and the concepts of identity and attraction in a safe way. And it allows them to right perceived wrongs. They can insert diversity into creative spaces where it's been missing. And if you're curious, there's no friction, but your own initiative to try for yourself. It's a great place to test the waters of being a writer. Fan fiction can be an act of generosity and also intensely personal, and often both. The fan fiction community is full of incredibly prolific writers. Just like in games, how whenever you have user-generated content, there's a small percentage of kind of overachievers and super creators who are creating the content for the majority of the other players who are consumers. And the same kind of thing happens in in fan fiction. In Star Stable, in our fan fiction community, we had one writer named Bergie who would post about a 2,000-word story as often as 5 times a week, sometimes more. And oftentimes in this world of fan fiction, these super creators are taking requests from their fellow readers and community members. It's a very intimate experience to see a story crafted just for you. And oftentimes there's people will create alternate universes or take their own characters and insert them into fiction. So it's a really intimate experience to kind of take your own character or identity or desires and insert it into a brand that everybody knows and loves. Fan fiction, it celebrates amateur works, but in the best way. It's free from the constraints of trying to be commercial, and with that layer of anonymity, fan fiction is a place that it doesn't judge. I mean, there are definitely judgments if you're a part of that community, but it has its own norms once you're in there. But it's easy there's no barrier to participate. And it can also be a path for marginalized voices to find readers and recognition, and in some cases, a career. So in a lot of ways, fan fiction is like Roblox. Roblox is full of tributes and clones and parodies of popular IP. Like here's a few images of Star Stable being recreated in Roblox. And from an outside perspective, you might think that this is kind of lazy design, but in another sense, it's an act of intense love. To go through all of that labor of trying to recreate something, and instead of starting from scratch, it's a lot of constraints and a lot of effort. So I think you should never underestimate somebody who works hard to recreate your work. And then finally, fan fiction can blur the line between reading, writing, and role play. And this is why I find the topic so interesting. It takes the building blocks of narrative, like characters, conflict, setting, and theme, and stretches a familiar story framework to the breaking point while still keeping it recognizable. So if you look at a game like Minecraft, the act of play and creation are truly one and the same. And not everyone is equally skilled, but everyone has the same language of play. So whether or not you're an amateur playing your first survival game, or you're going heavy into creative mode, it's easy to communicate and be a part of that community because the verbs of interaction are consistent. So how would you have that same sort of seamless experience with story? Well, interactive fiction makes the reading experience participatory, but I would argue that this tradition of storytelling, the author really holds the power, and it's not really an experience about empowering the player. You might have agency, but it doesn't really scratch the same itch of fan fiction. So I love interactive fiction, and this is not a judgment. I just don't think that these types of works are really satisfying in the same way that fan fiction does. Something that's a little bit closer, I would say, is when the community creativity kind of overlaps with procedural systems. That's when you really get that mix of familiar and delight and surprise, where a brand can truly seem limitless in its potential. So this is a really popular mod for The Sims 4. It's an unauthorized Harry Potter inspired mod called the Pufferhead. And it's just really fun because you have The Sims has all of its procedural engines, and you can add this other layer on top of it to create experiences that are reminiscent of something that you love. And you can have some amount of control, but still it really opens up the possibility space of what that brand can be. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to explore more in this direction with more intent, if you're able to kind of loosen up your expectations of a license. One of the most interesting experiments at the intersection of procedural systems right now is called Blaseball. If you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend digging into it. It's a surreal and very corny parody of sports betting, but mixed with a lot of evocative text and kind of eldritch twists. And it's done in collaboration with a thriving fan community. So even though the core game has this minimal interface, just text and a few icons, in the fan world, it's been interpreted as a rich world of characters and drama. And these are just some of the depictions of the late great player Jessica Telephone, who's just one of the dozens of characters who have fan art, and where fans are kind of developing their own canon based on the little procedural inputs that the game gives them. So how to make games to maximize the potential for fan fiction energy. So this is where I'm going to kind of get into some tips that might help you. By no means is this kind of the definitive list, but I think hopefully this can inspire you of how can you both set up your own games to support fan fiction, both within the game itself and kind of letting the players feel a little bit more control over their story experience, but also setting up for the kinds of stories that take place outside of the game. Well, first of all, you want to have characters for everyone. So you want an ensemble cast. You want characters who are distinct in both look and personalities. You want characters with flaws and with secrets. You want characters with layers that can be pulled back as you gain intimacy. Specificity is good in appearance and traits and backstory and pre-existing relationship dynamics. These details are hooks for a creative mind to riff off of. They'll inspire your audience. but you don't want to fill it in too much because you need gaps to spur curiosity and to leave room for your fans to fill in those blanks with their own takes. You want to contextualize for the small moments. You want those kind of intimate settings that allow for private encounters or small groups. You probably want to be able to push the camera in to see expressions on the characters' faces, so you can see when they blush, or what they look like when they're hiding something. You want a context that allows for drama, but restricts affordances. So you keep the language on human interaction. Too much action and explosions makes it really hard to tell that story. And if there's something happening that requires instant action, it pulls you out of the kind of the relationship mode and into the fight or flight mode. That's not really conducive to the kind of experiences that where fan fiction thrives. You want to have a common canon, and canon refers to those qualities of a story that are, or a story world that are universally true. So what you as a game creator consider canon will probably be a lot more restrictive than how the world might be interpreted by its fans. And that's great, because fans will figure out their own rules for what truly matters. And in the case of fan fiction, the canon that matters most is character personality. So you want to make sure that you present your characters consistently so that the community can recognize what's essential, and so that if your characters transcend the context of the core game, you put those characters in different situations or times, or that they're still recognizable. So yeah, you want the characters to hold up, both if your own game is going to take them out of their familiar setting, but also to allow players or writers to put their own spin on the characters and keep them recognizable. Because your audience will be extremely flexible with how they embrace change within a character, as long as they stay authentic and true to their nature. So now I'm going to give you a few examples from Star Stable and how this line of thinking has influenced our work here in the last few years. So during my tenure, the first character to get an update was a character called Idris, who's a circus ringmaster. So again, like Star Stable's been running for, we're going into our 10th year, but a lot of the assets are even older than that. We had the CD-ROM games, Starshine Legacy, and the original Star Stable CD-ROM games that are about 15 years old. So many of these assets are really showing their age. And so gradually we've been kind of updating them and trying to bring them to modern standards. So Idris here was the first character to get our new kind of gold standard for character design. So here's the new version. Aside from just the glow up of the character with it's more poly, we changed the age a little bit. It's just a much more attractive and modern character, but we also wanted to try to change the context. So instead of just having him stand around all the time, he has a fortune teller tent where he invites you in and reads your horoscope. And this character was a huge success. We saw a real explosion in the kind of fan works around Star Stable, fan fiction, fan art, videos and memes. So this character, it was very much an act of fan service, and definitely playing to the audience who likes to engage that way. But it also allowed the character to be someone that you could get to know more closely. And so we kind of continued to build on this tradition. These are the Soul Riders, who are the four main protagonists of Star Stable. They date back 15 years. These are the original designs from the original games and comics from 15 years ago. And so because these characters are the flagship heroes of our brand, they're the stars of the novels, and the main story quests, and the heroes that we use in our marketing to kind of speak to our values of who we want to be, we spent a very long time kind of revisiting them. And so the updated versions here, beyond just the poly count and the visuals, we wanted to revisit their backstories, their body types, and their hobbies to better reflect the diversity of our players and our values. And this involves some degree of retconning, which is a term from fandom when you take something that's assumed to be true, something that's canon, and you change the canon, and you can officially message that what used to be true is no longer true. This is the new truth. So we try to minimize that, because that can lead to fans rejecting. If they can't trust that something is true, then they're less likely to engage with it and treat it as something worthy of their own creation. But sometimes it's necessary. One example here is we had the character on the left. Her original name was Linda Chandler, and she was just a generic brown-washed version of all the other girl models. But instead, we wanted to give her a little bit more cultural specificity. So she's now, her last name went from Chandler to Chanda, and she's a Pakistani immigrant. We also made her a fangirl she does her own fan fiction. And we went through similar considerations with all our other characters to really make them special, trying to preserve as much as we could to make them recognizable and feel like a natural evolution, but also trying to keep them relevant. And then continuing with the idea of intimate spaces, we wanted to create the bedrooms and places where you could see these characters in their own private space. So here's Linda's room, and you can see some textiles from her homeland and some of her fan art and cosplay items from that side of her personality, and like her beloved pet cat Misty. So these kinds of spaces have gone over really well with fans. Here's another one of the bedrooms for Lisa, our musician, who has a little bit country. And so these kinds of spaces, they're not where the players spend most of their time. We are primarily a game that's spent on horseback. So going inside, it's not where players spend most of their formal gameplay. But even though they don't spend as much time here, it provides a high degree of value in terms of your attachment to the characters. And so when you encounter these characters in other contexts, when you are more consumed with action and writing and responding to more urgent events, you feel a stronger emotional bond to the characters. So these kinds of spaces can really give that context that makes the character shine. Our next task is we're going to be updating our villains. And this has been a particularly challenging project. So not only are the assets very old, this character here, Jessica, is one of the three original Dark Riders, but we also didn't really have an understanding of who they are aside from just being the villains. Like the original creative director when I came in was he had a hard time letting go of the characters, because if the heroes saw the villains, they would have to fight. There's no reason for them to coexist, because their sole purpose in life is to destroy the other, and it's not very interesting from a storytelling perspective, and it really puts limitations on how can you use these characters. So we did some soul searching and kind of revisited how do we recontextualize these characters, and how do we make sure that our villains as well as our heroes speak to our values. So Jessica here, she's deceitful, but she's also very fashionable, and aside from like the color black and her striking green eyes that carry over into kind of her mythical background, she's just basically been a color swapped version of our generic mean girls. So we really wanted to make her special. So our new version, we did a pretty thorough overhaul. So she's, of all the Dark Riders, she got the most substantial kind of retconning. So since all of our Dark Riders were basically white with long hair, we wanted to try to allow for more representation. So we reimagined Jessica, where we kind of pulled a few of the elements to allow that continuity, but now she goes by Jay, and she sports a more androgynous look, and she's still the most fashionable rider in the game. But now she's kind of has a very distinct personality that makes her stand out both from her fellow Dark Riders, but it's just as an interesting character, she's someone you want to get to know more about, and appealing to audiences that previously wouldn't have seen a character like that in the game. We also wanted to recontextualize how would you interact with this character. So in the case of Jay, since she's a very manipulative character, but she's also very social and chatty, we thought it would be fun to put her in a situation where she could be charming. And so we gave her a cafe. So she's going to be the proprietress of the Green Moth Cafe, where we can have some of those little intimate seatings where you can sit with characters and have conversations in a cozier setting. And she can still be a villain, and she can still be involved with manipulation and lies if that's what the plot demands. But most of the time, she's just enjoying cappuccinos and pastries with her clientele. So in conclusion, dating sim mechanics and intimacy, kind of the aesthetic of fan fiction is really having a moment in games, big and small. But I still think we're at the beginning of understanding how to dialogue with fans when we loosen up our protective instincts. And we kind of let go of curation and really embrace brand and story as a dialogue and not something that's purely author and consumer. So last year, the Archive of Our Own, that fan fiction repository online, won a Hugo Award, which is one of the highest honors in fiction. And this kind of validation of fan labor and kind of acknowledging that fans are more than consumers, that they are partners, it really means a lot. And I hope that we can continue to learn from the fans who love our fictional worlds with such passion that they feel compelled to create. And remember that no matter how many branches our stories offer and how expansive our updates are or how robust our tool sets are, a fan's creativity will never be sated by staying within the lines. They're going to push further, and that's a beautiful thing. And that's my talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jake. Lovely. I guess we're going to move on. Okay, cool. Shall we do the assignment now?
Do the assignment.
Yep. Okay.
Sure. I'll put it up.
Lovely.
Okay. Yeah, so the idea here is this is more of a written thought experiment. Feel free to use illustrations as well. But what we want to do is kind of put you in the mindset of what kinds of contexts work well for kind of tapping that fan fiction energy. So let's come up with a game module. Don't have to think about a full game experience, more of just a scenario in which, in that fan fiction tradition, that lets us get to know larger than life characters in a more intimate way. So start by picking a brand that you know and love, something from TV, movies, literature, doesn't matter. Some examples like Star Trek Discovery or The Queen's Gambit or RuPaul's Drag Race. It doesn't have to be a traditional fandom. Now you want to recontextualize those characters into a setting that lets them express their personalities while allowing for intimate conversations in a game. So like in games, like bars and cafes are pretty common, so that's a good safe standby, but I think it could be fun to look beyond that. So like a library or a swimming pool or someplace that just feels like a very personal place to get to know someone. Then you want to think about what kind of role does the player have in this scenario? Are you a peer, like a fellow guest? Are you a mentor or a mentee? Are you a receptionist or employee? So think about what's the power dynamics in the relationship for interaction. And now you have your game. So for example, maybe you're a bartender for a bar for droids in the Star Wars universe. And then think about some positive and negative outcomes that could happen in this game that would feel consequential to someone invested in the characters. So really don't think about plot, but think about how you can reveal character intimacy, get to know the characters, and have some sort of a change, whether it's positive or negative, that makes it feel like that conversation mattered. Like for example, if you had C-3PO came to your robot bar, you could convince him that he's been a jerk to R2-D2, and maybe he orders a stiff drink to forget, or maybe he walks away and resolves that he's going to apologize for his bad behavior. And then as a follow-up, this is probably outside of the scope, but if you have time and want to keep thinking about it, look at your scenario and think, is this robust enough to be a game on its own, or is this a module in a bigger game? And how would you build on this concept to make it into a full game? And does the concept hold up if you're using your own characters instead of working with an established brand? It's like I was saying with fan fiction, it's kind of it can be a form of like training wheels of a lot of the effort of kind of creating investment in characters is done for you, and you can leverage that. But if you're starting from scratch with your own characters, is this scenario a good way to get to know them? So that's the assignment. And I provided a PDF, so I think you should have access to the document if you need that as well.
Thank you, Jake. So good luck, everyone. Have fun.